Philip?
Do you think we're better off having one monopoly owner of the grid as a nation?
Well, the electricity distribution and transmission is a natural monopoly.
Hang on a minute. In America, quite a large part of it's owned by cooperatives, the network.
Yeah.
Do you think that's potentially a better way of doing things? I mean, there seem to be some sort of parallels between National Grid and BT here, in that, I mean, the rollout of broadband by BT is far from perfect. And yet they're the only ones who own, well, with the exception of a bit of cable here and there, that they pretty much own all of the fibre optic cabling. So therefore they've basically got us by the cojones. And therefore, in the same way that National Grid seems to have us by the cojones.
Well, National Grid, electricity transmission is a natural monopoly. That's a fact of life. It would make no sense to build
in which case, what are you regulating them?
We are, and we're regulating them to ensure that they deliver outputs that they operate in the way that's in the interest of consumers.
But there's no competition.
There's no competition, but we regulate their prices directly.
So what's your benchmark?
Proxy. Our benchmark is the ultimate benchmark is the setting an appropriate return on invested capital, which
so what is that?
Well, the latest return on invested capital, we've set a return on equity for National Grid. I think it's I'm just getting my figures right. We've just been through another one. I think it was 6.7%. I may be wrong.
What, at a time where bank base rates have just been reduced to 0.25%?
That's a return on equity. Obviously, the business is significantly funded by debt. The overall weighted average cost of capital would be close to 4%.
Okay, well that's still 16 times more than the rate that the European Central Bank has just said.
Well, this is a return on equity, and we judge their return relative to equity returns available in the market.
But how do you arrive at that benchmark of that being an acceptable return on equity?
By looking at equity returns that comparable businesses get in the market.
Do you compare it with the cooperative returns in America, where they're predominantly cooperatives owning the transmission network?
We certainly compare. I mean, well, there's several checks and balances on that. First of all, we're not the only regulator looking at regulating networks. You talked about Ofgem.
But if it's a monopoly, if it's a monopoly provider, presumably you only can have international comparisons.
Yes, well, we have international comparisons, and we have
international comparisons.
We have international comparisons, and we have I think our network costs and
which ones do you compare?
Well, the return on equity that network charges in the UK for shareholder-owned businesses, as opposed to cooperatives, I would compare favourably with those in the United States.
Right. So you do compare National Grid's return on equity with the return that, say, the cooperatives in America do, or say the cooperatives in New Zealand, or?
Well, no. National Grid is a shareholder-owned company, and once again, we can revisit the public policy framework.
Who are you comparing?
Which decided 25 years ago that the appropriate ownership model was to privatise these companies.
I'm not talking about the past. I'm on about now. Who do you compare National Grid with? What are your benchmark compare with share ownership, transmission networks?
Are you talking just simply about their return on capital?
Yeah, because
we compare it against all other similar regulated utilities, particularly in the UK, because obviously the market conditions
in the UK
are specific. We would compare it with the returns offered by Ofcom, British Airport, the CAA, by Ofwat, and ultimately the Competition Commission acts as the body of appeal for those decisions.
So they decide that 4% is an acceptable return.
So recently the Competition Commission, for example, looked at Northern Ireland Electricity. I think Northern Ireland Electricity appealed their price control set by the Northern Ireland regulator to the Competition Commission, and they took a view on the appropriate cost of capital and return.
Okay, so I come back.
And indeed, we are looking again at the returns that we're doing for the distribution companies in the light of that.
In summary, you do not determine that 4% is an acceptable return, the Competition Commission do?
We determine it, but we determine it within the context of what's happening in the equity markets, and so what returns similar companies give.
But as you've just hang on a minute. You have just said it's a monopoly provider, How on earth can you compare that with an equity market, which by definition is a market?
Because
I don't see how you can compare returns with an equity market.
National Grid has to compete for investment against other privately owned companies.
Oh, come off it! If it's a monopoly provider, it's going to be getting investment. If you know you're going to get 4% return,
sure. So we take.
Why do they have to compete?
So we adjust for those factors, but the ultimate benchmark.
How do you adjust for those factors?
Ultimately, an equity investor is going to have to look and see whether or not it wants to invest in National Grid or invest in an alternative.
Well, you can have a chat for me. I'll invest in National Grid. Guaranteed 4% return, monopoly provider.
But it's not a guaranteed 4% return.
Well, you just said it is.
No, it's not a guaranteed 4% return. It's a 4% return if they deliver the outputs efficiently for consumers.
Yeah, but what's your benchmark for them delivering that efficiently? I don't understand. You keep saying this is a benchmark and we're here to regulate to get a best return for the customer. Against what?
Because we scrutinise their business
plans. Who are they competing with?
Well, they're not competing, they're a monopoly. And what we're seeking to do is to try to put in place price controls that deliver good value for money for consumers, that incentivise National Grid to reduce costs, improve its performance, improve its outputs, and provides a return to its shareholders that is fair and in line with returns elsewhere in the market for similar investments. And the checks and balances for that, there is a process where the Competition Commission will do exactly the same as us and will come up to its own view, and that ultimately is the body for appeal. And that appeal is available not only to the companies, but that appeal is available to people who represent consumer groups as well. So if anyone thinks that we're setting a too generous a rate of return for these companies, they do have the opportunity to appeal that, whether it's supply companies or whether it's consumer groups.
Finally, so you think that having a monopoly provider is a good system?
No, I think it's inevitable when you're looking at a natural monopoly business like transmission and distribution. If we could introduce competition in this market, we would look at ways of doing that, and we do in parts of the value chain. And
which then begs the question, does it not, that if you're going to have a privately owned, shareholder-owned company arrangement, maybe that arrangement isn't appropriate for the transmission of electricity and gas?
Well, I think the combination of shareholder or private sector incentives combined with our effective incentive-based regulation has delivered huge value for money for consumers. Network charges. Network charges have halved over the first 15 years since privatisation. Yeah. They've gone up since on the back of the significant investment that's been needed. And over that period, we've seen a 25% reduction in outages, and we've seen the networks increase in their size and extent. I think that's delivered tremendous value. Our networks are amongst the lowest priced network charges, amongst the lowest in Europe. And that's partly because of our effective incentive-based regulation that we put in place.
Okay.
So I think we've got a really good track record on this, and I'm prepared to defend it to the hilt.